officials, members of the General Assembly, yes, it's my pleasure to present to you a great American, a man of several successful careers, a graduate of West Point, successful in the Army Air Force, as a test pilot, astronaut, commander of Apollo 8 flight, and in business, chairman, president, and chief executive officer of Eastern Airlines. He also serves on several board of directors of large corporations in America, one of which we are most familiar with, Southern Bell. He's a great salesman, too. In his own company, he convinced 33,000 Eastern Airline employees to chip in to help Eastern Airlines. Eastern Airlines has profited from this help, and so have the employees. And you can tell it when you ride Eastern. To paraphrase one of his advertisements, he has won his wings. He's been successful in assistance to our government. He served as special presidential ambassador to the Far East in Europe in 1966, 1968, and in 1970 undertook another special presidential mission to seek support for release of American prisoners in North Vietnam. Our speaker has received many honorary degrees, special honors, and service decorations, one of which was the first Congressional Space Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. I met our speaker several years ago when he spoke to an airport operators convention and had followed his career. It became my duty to select the speaker. I immediately thought of the President of Eastern Airlines. So I'm particularly pleased that we have him here today. In addition to my responsibilities to the South Carolina Chamber, I am chairman of the Columbia Metropolitan Airport Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you a man who is fondly referred to by his employees as the Moon Man, Mr. Frank Borman. But thank you all for the very warm reception. I'm very happy to be here today. Eastern has a long relationship with South Carolina. Matter of fact, we started serving South Carolina just about 49 years ago, and Columbia 48 years ago. I think it's perfectly appropriate to have someone from the airline industry talk to you in keeping with the theme of your program, Economic Freedom in the 80s. Because there's perhaps no other industry that has undergone such a radical change in the last 2 years, no other industry in the country that has had such a change in philosophical direction from a governmental standpoint than has the industry that I serve in today. I think in order to discuss the prospects for the 80s, and if you will, develop the case that the airlines may well be a prototype for other American industries, we might just examine the industry's record of service. I suspect that you could say that the airlines first became a significant public service industry just about 52 years ago. Throughout the first years of their existence, they were carefully nurtured and really treated as a quasi-public utility, heavily controlled as to routes, prices, aspirations, and so on. And quite frankly, they did the job very well. If you examine by any standard the record of the American airline industry service to the society, you have to believe, I think, that it's remarkable. This was struck home to me last year when I had to make a speech in New Orleans. And in preparation for it, I looked up the original timetable that we'd had in serving New Orleans, New York. And it was quite, I suspect that there was no truth in advertising back in the 30s, because it mentioned that you left New Orleans, I believe it was around 6 o'clock at night, and you arrived in New York 10 o'clock the next morning after, I believe it was 11 stops, all ready for a full day's business in New York City. Now, the interesting thing about this advertisement wasn't the general exaggeration that was evident there and the hype, but the fact that the bill, the fare, for 1936 was something like $76.25. At the time I spoke in New Orleans, which was about 40 years later, that same trip made nonstop in a jet was 25 cents cheaper. So it's 40 years of offsetting the ravages of inflation, of improved service, and really remarkable contribution to a growing industrialized society. And I'd like to stand here and tell you that that record of service was due to superior management, or a more dedicated workforce, or more enlightened regulation. But you all know better than that. The fact of life is the remarkable record that the industry enjoyed was primarily due to ever-increasing advances in American aviation technology. Compare the productivity of a DC-3 in the 30s to the productivity of the A300 of the 1011 today. Along the way, the industry, perhaps more than any other, with the possible exception of the electronic industry, was able to re-equip and stay abreast of the most technically proficient and efficient machine available. And the beneficiary in the final analysis was not the stockholder, but the employees and the passengers. The record of profitability in the first 50 years of the airline industry has frankly been abysmal. I saw the other day that in the Exxon in 1 year had a higher percentage or higher absolute earning than the entire airline industry has had in 50 years. And I'm not knocking Exxon's earnings because I think they were justified. Nevertheless, the point is that the benefits of technology flowed basically to the employees, who had a ever-increasing pay scale benefits, and to the passengers, who had remarkably improved conditions of service, and of course a remarkable stable ticket price, all under the careful and watchful eye of the Civil Aeronautics Board. And then about 5 years ago, coincident with the first tremors of fuel shortages, a remarkable occurrence began to take place. The ticket prices began to go up at an ever-increasing rate. Now, two things had happened. One is quite apparent. The Arab boycott, 74, put an ever-increasing burden on the industry because of the increasing fuel costs. Let me give you an example. 1973 at Eastern, we used about 1 billion gallons of kerosene. It cost us $117 million. 79, we used about the same amount. It cost us about $700 million. In 80, we'll use about the same amount, and it'll cost us over $1 billion, all for the same input of fuel. Now, along the way, obviously, we've done a lot of things to increase the fuel efficiency in response to that rapid increase in prices. I'm happy to tell you that at Eastern, we have improved the fuel efficiency with which we transport one passenger 1 mile by some 44% in the last 6 years, which I think is a considerable achievement. Nevertheless, that ever-increasing cost of our basic raw material fuel coincided with a plateauing in subsonic aviation technology. In other words, although we have had 2 or 3 successive generations of new jet airplanes, the tremendous step function and increase in productivity simply did not continue through. There's just no way to compare the productivity increase we got when we replaced the DC-7s and the Constellations with the 727s and the DC-9s. True, the newer airplanes are more efficient, but the insidious hand of inflation began to really soak up all of the benefit from technology that previously flowed to the employees and the passengers of the airline. The inevitable result, I had already mentioned, the ticket price began to go up. Now, faced with this unique phenomenon in an industry that has always been considered as a semi-quasi-public utility, economists from both the left and the right began to search for ways to offset the increase in ticket price. And I must tell you that the strange bedfellows, all the way from Senator Kennedy to Milton Friedman, said, let's deregulate the airline industry. Let's let the marketplace tell it where to deploy its assets, and let's see if give management the opportunity to manage and see really what happens. It's interesting to note that the philosophical input for these divergent views or divergent camps were totally different. I think Friedman and the more conservative economists made this presentation basically because they thought it would be in in the most economic way to deploy the country's resources to the maximum benefit of the most good. And I'm quite confident that the economists on the left and the liberal politicians made it because simply the consumer was suffering. Whatever it was, the outcome was the same. Let's deregulate the airline industry. And I must admit that with the exception of United, every airline management, including yours truly, dramatically resisted the move to cut the fetters, to cut the umbilical cord that bound us to the good friend, the federal government, with all of the reassurance that a franchise can produce. And frankly, Eastern at that time was in, I should say, less than robust financial health. Matter of fact, we had really only two assets when this proposition was beginning to be discussed in the middle 70s. One was our franchise, and the other was our employees. Our fleet was outmoded, our management was askew, and we were a demoralized airline. I was frankly not willing to undertake the risk of the dynamics involved in changing the total environment in which we operated. But good Lord operates in strange ways. Our cry went unheeded. The airlines were simply turned loose about 18 months ago, and in a kind of a sunset provision, we are now operating every year in a dramatically freer economic environment. And I'm the first to tell you that it's a dramatically better economic environment. In the final analysis, the competitive forces have caused relatively few inconveniences to the traveling public, but there's simply no way that the industry could have responded to the dramatic increases in fuel prices that have occurred in the last 2 years without the freedom to adjust, to compete, and if necessary, to fail. Well, I suggest to you that if indeed the airline industry is a prototype, if almost as a court of last resort, the Congress and the executive branch turn to the marketplace, it may well be time for the legislators at every level to examine every industry with the idea to reducing the fetters. It seems to me until we finally allow the competitive forces that have shaped the economic destiny of this country to really work, we are going to be plagued with increasing and unfortunately insidious inflation. Now, when I project the future of this industry into the 80s, I do so from a very, very precarious vantage point. You can name very few industries that are more capital intensive than an airline. A 727 that when we first bought 12 years ago, and of course depreciated at the purchase price, cost about $4.5 million. To replace that same machine today, the same productivity, same everything, same speed, costs one about $17 million. Highly capital intensive. Labor, the greatest friend of the labor forces in the airline industry, and in that I include management, because after all, hopefully we labor. I like to think we do. The greatest friend of the employee force in the industry was the regulatory process. The unreasonable demands for wage and benefit escalation were simply passed along through a regulatory process that took little heed in competitive forces. So we're highly labor intensive. But at Eastern, in keeping with the industry average, about 42 cents of every dollar goes to employees. And then, of course, fuel. Highly fuel and energy dependent. Although I like to point out, and I think it's important to point out, that the entire airline industry uses a little less than 2% of the energy involved in this country. So we're not massive users of the energy, but the fuel costs have become an ever-increasing part of our economic equation. Capital intensive, labor intensive, energy dependent. What do I see for the 80s? Well, amazingly enough, I'm remarkably optimistic about the 80s to an unfettered industry. I think that there certainly will be dislocation. I think there will be and need to be additional mergers. I think, unfortunately, that there will be failures, and I hope if there are failures, the government in their wisdom will not subscribe to the Chrysler bailout. I strongly support Christianity without hell. I don't believe that either one can succeed without the other. So there will be that. What about the traveling public? What can you expect? You can expect, I think, an increasing number of commuter airlines, smaller airlines. You can expect some market dislocation. You've seen some with Piedmont pulling out of your Miami and New York market here. You can also expect to see, I think, an improved standard of service from the standpoint of operational reliability. And those of you in Columbia, when we open the new terminal in Atlanta, I hope you can experience a better existence in trying to fight your way through there than you have today. There's no question that the frills will be going. There's no question that there will be more seats on the airplane. There's no question that first class may turn into a different type of environment. All in furtherance of keeping the ticket price down, because today the marketplace is the final arbiter in the price that we charge for our product. And it's a remarkably efficient method of making management search for more efficient ways of producing goods. Now, it seems to me that there are three basic courses that any industry, particularly an industry that's as capital, labor, and energy intensive as airlines, have to take. First of all, we'll have to grow. Some managements are cutting back. I think that you cannot look forward to success in an inflationary environment by retrenching. We'll have to have some growth. Second, without question, we'll have to have increased employee productivity. Now, many of I don't like to use the word philosopher so often, but many of the people that try to examine the American scene have said we have to inevitably accept a deteriorating standard of living. And I reject that, absolutely and totally. It is quite clear, though, that we're going to have to make certain that we get 7.5 hours at least out of our employees for an 8-hour day, and it's quite clear that the employees are going to have to bear some of the ravages of inflation that have increasingly in the past been passed off on technology improvements. And finally, we have to, it seems to me, perhaps, I'm certain in Eastern, and I think perhaps in American industry in general, find a mechanism that relates the profitability of the company to the labor cost of the company. Now, we've had a remarkable experience at Eastern, and I'd like to just dwell on that with you for a moment. My first official act as president in 1975 was to face an audience of New York bankers. Not quite this large, but we owed a hell of a lot of money. I've got to tell you, there were a lot of bankers there. And we had $75 million worth of notes coming due, and we didn't have the $75 million. So in our best presentation, we prepared slides with a proper hand for the pointers, and a remarkably slick job, really. And I performed well. And we all, it's rather like having a baby, really. You know, your wife goes into the living room, you go out in the hall, and all of the management was clapping their hands and patting me on the back for the remarkable job I've done, and they were quite clear that the bankers would roll over that $75 million loan for us. And after about a half an hour, I knew we were in trouble, and when they finally came out in an hour, I knew we were in trouble because the banker was smiling. In any event, the answer was no, we won't extend that $75 million loan. And that, at that point, I think, started a remarkable resurgence in Eastern, because we went to the employees, and in a almost politically oriented campaign, we're able to convince the 33,000 people that comprise it, that are the guts and the soul of the airline. And believe me, it's the people that make the airline. We're able to convince them that their long-term financial security was dependent upon their short-term sacrifice. And in '76, they all took a wage freeze. And this is a company that is involved with about 40% of our people unionized. I went back to the bankers. They understood that the employees had kicked in. We got the $75 million rolled over, and '76 was one of our more profitable years. Now, we coupled that wage freeze with a profit-sharing plan. And I'm happy to tell you that every employee that did not take an increase in '76 but elected to participate in the profit-sharing plan has received more than his money back and still has another year of profit-sharing to go. But when we tried to look at how we re-equipped the airline in this capital-intensive business, it was quite clear that we had to have more than a short-term one-year wage freeze. And again, we went to the employees and suggested that since their long-term financial interests were at stake, they should risk 3.5% of their salary to subsidize profits. Let me tell you how that works. If you work at Eastern now, you make $100 a month, you only take home $96.50. At the end of the year, if we meet our profit objective, which has been discussed with you, we refund that $3.5 to you. If we don't make it, your $3.5 goes to subsidized profits. If we exceed that profit level, we'll pay you up to $3.5 above your $100 salary. And it's been remarkably effective. Last year, in '78, we were able to pay a bonus of about $12 million to employees. This year, the workforce contributed about $15 million to our profit level. And it's had two things. For number one, it's put the employee at Eastern in a remarkably direct position from the standpoint of his interest in the service and the profitability of the company. And it seems to me that it's gone a long way in helping us look at the decade of the 80s with a lot more confidence than we could have had we not had this program that inherently ties labor rates to profitability. So, I think that that is something else that will inevitably follow in American industry. The hard facts, the simple facts, are that we have a tremendous resilience in this country. We have a tremendous capacity to grow, to succeed, to innovate, and of course we have been living, I think, if you will, for many years in a kind of a never-never land where we thought that it all came without price. You know, I had a remarkable experience in 1968. It seems hard to believe it's over 11 years ago. But almost any time I meet anyone, it happened here today, prior to the luncheon, the first question what was it like going to the moon? What did you feel like? What was it like? And of course it was the high point of my life to find myself circling the moon Christmas of 1968, recognizing full well that we were the first human beings that were there that had viewed any planet from that distance, 60 miles above. And I'm happy to tell you that in the first 5 or 6 orbits, you as taxpayers got your money's worth. We worked like hell. We took pictures of everything that we could find on the lunar surface. We tried to be, as we were, pathfinders, understand where Apollo 11 could land. Thank you. We made scientific experiments, we did television programs, and we were very industrious. And then on about the 7th or 8th revolution, I looked up, and there coming over the lunar surface was the Earth. And I must tell you, this was the most remarkable part of a truly fantastic voyage. Because there, in the remoteness of a totally black and forbidding space, was a fragile, beautiful blue globe, been referred to as the big blue marble. And of course, Christmas, a very sentimental time, all of our thoughts back to our families and our loved ones. And I must tell you, without any embarrassment and in total honesty, that my thoughts on that lonely Christmas Eve went back to what is truly important to the people that live and inhabit this blue marble. And as I went through the list, material success and important, health, absolutely. But it seems to me when you get down to the bottom line, in the final analysis, the concept of freedom, individual liberty that we enjoy and understand here in this country is our most prized possession. And then when you try to understand how many other human beings on this earth enjoy that, and in the final reality you acknowledge to yourself that those that do, and they're precious few, are dependent upon a little over 200 million Americans for that strength and for that umbrella that allows them to develop as God's children, as individuals in a free society, you recognize that we have a total requirement that exists with few other societies in the world today. And I think in many ways, in our fractious, selfish way, we've avoided that, or at least avoided thinking about it. Today, we're talking about that requirement, that umbrella of American security being dependent upon the military. And heavens knows that I'm a strong advocate of military preparedness. I spent 20 years in the military. I have two sons that were in the military. One still is. A great many of my friends are. No question you cannot avoid the fact that we have a tremendous responsibility there. But in the final analysis, the absolute dependent of both our military strength and our political freedom is absolutely and totally dependent upon the economic freedom that this country enjoys. And it seems to me that those of us in this room and those of us that stop to think beyond the next complaint or the selfish interest of some particular special interest group had better recognize that there's a total and absolute requirement to wend our way back to a competitive, open, and strengthened economic environment that involves a hell of a lot more free enterprise and a hell of a lot less government regulation. Thank you very much. To your home a memento of your visit to South Carolina, which in some way, I don't know quite how they arrived at this, but anyways, it's a Pawleys Island hammock. And I can't picture you in that. Thank you very much. I'm sure your wife and sons will enjoy it. As a matter of fact, it'll hold two, so. Ladies and gentlemen, and members of the legislature and the press, I'd like to close this meeting with a few remarks of my own. I want to say that I appreciate the responsibility entrusted in me to be the leader of the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce during 1980. I happen to be an individual, I think you know from my own track record, which does call for involvement. And I think I've got probably 8 or 10 people from my company here today who stand as witness to the fact that if they weren't here, I wouldn't be able to do what I set out to do, because I rely on their support to keep those home fires burning back in the great metropolis of Johnsonville, South Carolina. In any event, I want it to be known that the State Chamber of South Carolina is going to be and is going to be the bastion of freedom for the free enterprise system in South Carolina. I would like to